Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest has written a book that, in my opinion, should be read by every employer, employee, and manager in every workplace. The World Health Organization says that 1 in 4 people worldwide will be impacted by a diagnosed mental health condition at some point in their lives, and that figure is expected to increase significantly because of the pandemic. So we need this book now more than ever. Our guest started out as a clinical mental health therapist and then became an organizational psychologist, working with some of the biggest employers in the world to equip company leaders and staff to constructively talk about mental health and mental illness in the workplace. Her book is entitled, Yes, You Can Talk About Mental Health at Work. Here's why and how to do it really well. It's an informative, thought-provoking discussion of the issues and barriers that have prevented the very necessary and constructive conversations we need to have at work about mental health. And it's a practical roadmap for how to destigmatize the working environment so we can create psychologically safe workplaces and have those conversations in an appropriate and empathetic way. I'm delighted to welcome Melissa Doman to our show. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I have been so looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me, Harvey.
Melissa, you're an organizational psychologist who focuses on the systemic issues like workplace culture, leadership development, behavior change. And you say that discussing mental health, mental illness, and stress at work is absolutely essential. What made you write the book?
Honestly, what made me write the book is someone had to. And I make the joke, especially because I do tons of stuff in the tech space. I went from the back end job of being a clinical therapist that people spoke to in shrouded privacy that felt they couldn't talk about it anywhere else, to the organizational psychologist on the front end, where I'm trying to encourage these people to bring these conversations out to the forefront in the world of business because they literally cannot afford not to. It has always been an important conversation, and now companies are realizing it is a must-have conversation. I saw tons of great stuff around building mental health awareness, teaching people about the stigma, teaching people about where these things come from, but no one was telling them how to have the conversation. It was kind of like Will Ferrell in Talladega Nights. He's like, I don't know where to put my hands. And you got to give people the steps, the language. It's not like the Matrix where you can plug in the skill set in the back of your head overnight. You have to learn the skill set and give people the concrete guidelines to do so. It's developing a skill set like any other skill set and needs to be treated as such. So I wanted to make this all-in-one guide to say, here's where we came from. Here's where we are now. Here are the obstacles that still remain. Here's what happens if the conversation goes wrong. Here's what to say, what not to say, and when to say it. And writing it in real time during the pandemic to show those real-time learnings from chronic stress, COVID-19, and continued systemic racism around the world. And I wanted it all in one package so anybody could pick it up and use it.
You started out by defining mental health and mental illness. Are these terms commonly misunderstood?
Yes. So mental health is something that every human being on the planet shares. Even animals have it, mammals have it. This is an organ like any other organ in the body. It has a health state, a stress state, and an illness state. Mental health is our baseline social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. That includes good emotions, negative emotions, and everything in between. Mental illness is a clinically diagnosable mental health condition that impacts your cognitive, social, and emotional functioning. And you have to have a certain number of characteristics happening at the same time for a certain duration of time. Examples of that: generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, anorexia, PTSD, narcissistic personality disorder, and 300 plus other disorders in the DSM-5. As I'm very happy that you mentioned, that number 1 in 4, I would bet dollars to donuts in our lifetime will become 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 because of the global trauma that everyone has been and is continuing to go through.
Do you think that in recent years, mental health problems have become over-medicalized, with people being much too quick to label every unhappy emotion with a diagnosis?
Oh, 100%. I think that we vacillate between steering very, very, very far away from a label, and other people are very much over medicalizing, and they want to use that diagnosis as either, a reason why they can't do certain things, or they want to attach to that diagnosis. And it almost becomes a bit self-limiting. But the thing is that having a diagnosed mental health condition is not the same as experiencing uncomfortable emotions or grief or sadness or general worry. And so people need to understand that just because you're experiencing a negative emotion or chronic stress, which can mimic like a mood disorder, it doesn't mean that you have a mental illness. On the other side, there are lots of people that because they haven't had that education for a whole smorgasbord of reasons, that they need that access to the nomenclature, to the naming, to understand what it is they're experiencing so they can take action and steps to manage it. Because the goal with mental illness is not to find a cure. It doesn't make any sense when people say that. It's about promoting awareness and insight and encouraging people to use those resources to self-manage within their circle of control and influence, because no one will help you manage that if not for you.
I know your goal is to create working environments where everyone feels safe to discuss mental health, but there are certain industries like medicine, politics, government, law, where it's widely believed that having a diagnosed mental health condition, being chronically stressed or expressing feelings of distress, are seen as a sign of weakness or inability to do the job. How do we change those misconceptions?
Oh my gosh. The fact that those industries and those people are treated as if they need to dehumanize themselves is beyond me. And it is completely unsustainable, because every person in those industries is a human first and that professional second. And because those industries are very high stakes, if they make a mistake in their job, the consequences can be quite large. So wouldn't you say that those people need a safe place to discuss what's going on with their mental health, to take advantage of those intervention points so they can feel better and work better? The standard has to change. It is completely ridiculous. At the beginning of the pandemic, I did a session for 50 doctors and nurses for the National Health Service in the UK. The look of desperation on those people's faces, Harvey, I've never wanted to not let down a group of people more than those doctors and nurses. They just wanted someone to say, it's okay to be terrified. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to feel like none of this is in your control. Someone has to give them the permission, because just because your job is high stakes doesn't mean that you check your brain at the door. If anything, you should be paying more attention to it.
Yeah, not just your brain, your emotions.
Yes, very much. And people tend to forget that because this organ governs our emotions, how we do our work, how we look at ourselves, how we interact with other people. Someone decided that made it the boogeyman. And I'm calling BS on the whole thing. Just because this organ controls who we are doesn't mean that we should treat it with fear and distance. If anything, we should be paying more attention to it because of its influence on our lives.
Well, in my career as a judge, Melissa, and a lawyer before that, I've seen people who needed to take time off work, what we commonly call a stress leave, due to a mental health problem. But they soldier on because they worry that if they take time off, they'll be seen as unstable or unreliable. They'll never get a promotion. And unfortunately, Melissa, they're right.
Oh, yes.
I've seen it happen. So what do you say to managers who are afraid to promote someone who took a mental health leave in the past?
That is such a good question. And I'm very honest, as you know, with my, readers and followers, that the thing is that the stigma does still exist. And so people making these ridiculous assumptions about people taking healthful steps to take space to manage their mental health, it still happens. So when people say we need to get this mental health discussion in every company, in every industry, I say, yeah, that's the ideal, but that's not the reality. We need to get it in as many companies and as many industries as possible, so that industries and companies that aren't discussing it become the odd ones out. So this is a slow burn, Harvey, in terms of, shifting thousands of years worth of stigma. That's how long it's been around. That you got to help managers understand that just because someone is taking time off for a mental health issue is no different than someone taking time off for a physical illness. It is no different, because when you reach a burnout stage or you literally can't function, your brain is going, well, I tried to warn you and give you emotional symptoms and physical symptoms, so I'm now going to shut you down because you weren't listening, and this is why we can't have nice things. That's what burnout is. So people who go off on stress leave, they should be admired because they had the courage to say, I am not okay, and I need the space to sort myself out so I can come back and do my work really well. So the manager should not only be inspired by that courage, but do their level best to help reintegrate that person into the workplace so they can be successful. It should be nothing else other than that.
I couldn't agree more. You wrote about toxic positivity at work.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us what it is and why it's a bad thing?
Yes. So let me first say that when people engage in toxic positivity, it really generally comes from a good place. So generally speaking, they're trying to offer silver lining. They're trying to help fix things. They're trying to help take the edge off. But you're not supposed to do that all the time, because we come pre-programmed out of the box with these negative emotions for a very clear reason: to tell ourselves and other people that we are not okay or something is not okay and we need help. That is why that's there. So if you're constantly greeting someone with, oh, tomorrow's a new day, everything's going to be okay, well, at least this didn't happen, what that's actually doing is telling that person, your negative thoughts and emotions have no place in this conversation and they make me uncomfortable. So I'm going to try and move you on from that. Most people, when I explain this concept, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea I was doing that. Because you're encouraged to do that. We're conditioned to do that, because anything other than that is a non-can-do attitude, and no one wants anything to do with that, apparently. The more helpful thing is just letting people feel how they feel. It doesn't mean that they should stay stewing in it for 8 months. You want to experience the emotion and move through it. But the more helpful thing, like let's say, for example, that something happened to you, Harvey, that really upset you. The more helpful thing to say is, that really sucks. I am so sorry that happened. Are you okay? As opposed to, oh, well, it's okay. At least this didn't happen. What a great way to feel not seen and not heard. So you got to balance the positivity with everything else, because hope is wonderful, but too much of anything is not very helpful.
100%. Now, you briefly touch on bullying in the workplace and the mental health consequences of being bullied. In my experience, bullying is very often caused by professional jealousy. And trust me, Melissa, I know what that feels like. How do you suggest that people in that situation deal with it?
I can even give you my own personal example as someone who's been bullied by managers in the workplace. It really comes down to, there is always a reason why people do it. And even if you're on the receiving end of the bullying, and granted, I have tons of examples in the book and from other people, so my voice alone is not enough. This is the voice of many. There's always a reason why someone bullies you, whether it's at school, whether it's at work. You just change it into an adult playground with different toys. And you got to seek to understand why. There is a reason. And the bully may not love that you're inquiring about that, because it's really about calling out the behavior, but seeking to understand why it's happening and letting that person know without confusion what it's doing to you. So for example, I was bullied by a manager in the past who very clearly had favoritism as her top characteristic. And it went on and on and on and on. And she saw my look on my face one day. She said, oh, are you okay? I said, no, I am not okay. I said, do you want to talk? I said, I do. And we spoke, and I said very clearly, you clearly don't like me. You clearly are trying to make my life hell in this company. You're negatively impacting my mental health at and outside of work. To which this person replied, what's your proof? So I basically realized that conversation wasn't going to go anywhere. So it came down to setting my own boundaries, and other people have done very similar things through the guidance I've given. I say, people can't always give you what you want or what you need. So if it comes to the case where a bully is going, I don't care about your feedback, you have to look at what's in your control and influence about setting boundaries of behavior. So for that example, it's, I am not okay when you treat me A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I am not willing to put up with this behavior anymore. So how are we going to work in a collegial fashion? Because this is not sustainable. So when you stand up to a bully, it can go one of two directions. They either respond to that strength or they get even more upset. So it's about finding a way to let them know that their behavior is not permissible, hopefully finding out the reason they're doing it so you can move on from that. But if there's an unwillingness on their part, you have to self-advocate, because no one will stand up for you if not for you. And separately, if you are being bullied by a manager and through your own intervention attempts, it's not going so well, depending on the setup in your organization, you may have to make the decision to escalate that to their boss or human resources, because it's just not okay. And workplace bullying is rampant. And I have a couple of stories in the book about that, especially when people got bullied for mental health issues, which is unconscionable. But if they're not going to give you what you need and what you're looking for, you have to set the boundary and you have to explain to them, I see you. I'm not okay with what you're doing. And this is how I'm going to change my behavior to not engage with that.
I'm really glad I asked you that question. And I hope everybody who's been in that situation took notes. Now,
please stand up for yourself, guys.
Now, as you know, Melissa, we're living in a gotcha society. Everyone seems to be only too ready and willing to destroy you for one wrong word or an inadvertent comment that is perceived as politically incorrect or is taken out of context or blown out of proportion. In that kind of environment, many managers dare not ever embark on any conversations touching on an employee's personal life. So what do you say to managers who live in fear of opening what they see as a very risky and dangerous Pandora's box?
I understand the concern, because those concerns are very valid. We live in a world where saying just the wrong word can land you in a lot of trouble, and cancel culture is at its peak and may continue to be for quite some time, including public shaming. And so what it really comes down to is being ultrasonic clear about very intentional language and statement of intention. Those things are a must-have when it comes to these conversations, because people's brains are very creative in terms of coming up with a reason of why you said something, how you said something, and what you didn't say. So if you're going to raise a concern about employees' mental health and you've never talked to them about it before, maybe just diving in saying, you've seemed depressed recently. Are you okay? Number one, don't say that. Number two, there is no context. That person immediately will go, well, I guess I'm getting fired. Please don't do that. It's all about using statement of intention, what you've noticed. Please don't tell people how they think or feel, because you have no idea how they're thinking or feeling. It's saying what you've noticed, explaining why you're bringing it up, and to make sure that person knows that it's not coming from a place of evaluation or threat. So let's say, for example, that you've noticed that one of your team members just hasn't really seen themselves for the past month. In a one-on-one or something like that, it really comes down to, I hope it's okay I'm mentioning this, but you just haven't seen yourself the last few weeks. If you don't mind my asking, is everything okay? You know, I'm your manager. I want you to be able to talk to me. There's nothing to worry about. I'm just checking in, like, person to person. It is their choice whether or not they share with you, but you have to be intentional about your wording and statement of intention, because if you don't, they will fill in the gaps.
Okay, so Melissa, when I discussed your book with a senior manager in a government agency, she said
Ah!
she said to me that if an employee's mental health issues don't affect their performance at work, then they're irrelevant. And if the mental health issues do affect their work, then it should be dealt with as a performance issue. What's your response to that?
I respectfully disagree with that person a lot. No offense. But here's the thing. If someone's mental health is impacting their performance, that should not turn into a performance management thing or punitive thing. It turns into a resource needed thing. It turns into a medical thing because you want to give that person the tools and the resources to help themselves feel better so they can do that better work. People don't choose to have mental health issues. They don't choose to have a mental illness. So punishing them like it is a choice is a great way to make that person quit and go work for organizations that do understand the intersections between mental health and performance. And it could be a case of they might be in the wrong role, or the role might be pushing them beyond their comfort levels and they need to be put somewhere else where they can thrive. Or it could be that they felt they didn't have permission to reach out for help for any number of reasons. So approaching a performance issue based on mental health is a very sticky situation and a great way to get into a complex problem that might go sideways in ways that you don't want for it to. So it's about seeking to understand what's going on and offering to refer that person to resources. If someone is trying to, I'll just use an example. If someone is trying to be a marathon runner and on the 10th mile, they break their ankle, you're not going to criticize them and say, well, why can't you finish the race? You go, oh my God, let me get you a scan and a splint, and let's find ways to help you finish. Why is this any different?
Yeah, exactly. Now, every workplace has at least one gossip. So when you disclose personal information to a colleague and sometimes even to a manager, you have to be prepared that it may not stay confidential and everyone will know your personal business. How do you protect yourself against that?
Well, number one, that's very true. And I'm sure you'll recall in the book that there were some folks whose information was shared without their consent. And then when they confronted those people who shared their information, they just called the person paranoid or dismissed what they said, which is the ultimate slap in the face. So if you're going to share about mental health at work, it's not just like, oh, this big wave of sharing, let's have everybody talk about it together. That's not the world we live in. It has to be sharing with purpose. Who are you telling? Why are you telling them? Do you trust that person? Those are the three first questions you got to ask yourself. And most importantly, what do you want them to do with the information? And then adding on here, you need to state your concerns and fears right up front. If you're concerned about privacy, if you want the information to stay between the two of you, you must make that explicitly clear. Saying to that person, I'm really nervous to tell you. It's not that I don't trust you, but this is really personal. And I would like the respect that you're going to keep this between us. And also state your other fears. If you're concerned they'll judge you or look at you differently. People are not mind readers. You got to tell people what your fears are because they're just not going to know unless you tell them. And on top of that, there are some people who are unintentional gossips who let things slip because they're like, oh, I didn't think it was a big deal. Well, if it is a big deal, you need to tell that person ahead of time what that boundary is. Make sure there's no room for interpretation and no one can control that but you. So just front load those comments and set the expectations so there's zero confusion.
I want to just reinforce something you've just said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying in part is that if you're experiencing a mental health issue and you want to speak to your boss about it, you should first decide what it is you want them to do about it. By that, I mean, there should be a specific outcome you want from that conversation. Is that right?
100%, because keep in mind, When you're sharing with a manager, you can't just put the information out into the abyss and expect them to know what to do with it. They're learning how to have these conversations too. And just because someone's a manager doesn't mean that they already know what to do. So are you telling them because you want to know what mental health resources are available at the company? Are you telling them because you're acting a bit differently and you don't want them to assume why? Are you telling them because you want them to connect you to HR because you might need some form of accommodation? Or are you telling them just because you just want them to know if you act differently in the near future? You got to be intentional and purposeful why you're sharing the information, because sharing without purpose is a great way for things to just go off the rails in ways that you didn't anticipate. So oftentimes a lot of the onus, and Harvey, I'm sure you'll agree, a lot of the onus is on the listener. A lot of the onus is on the receiver and on the organization and the leaders to make sure that the environment is safe to share. That's all important and that's all very true, but there's also individual responsibility and accountability for the chronologically aged adults who are sharing this personal information at work. You have to tell people what is it that you need. You have to tell them what you're struggling with, what they can do, or who they can refer you to, because you can't just expect them to know. You are also responsible in this conversation for how you self-advocate.
So what should you do if someone at work discloses something that's an emergency or requires further action? For example, if a person tells you they're about to harm themselves or someone else, or if they disclose that they were the victim of a crime like a sexual assault, what should you do?
So let's take self-harm or harm to others as an example. So this is very much an exception to privacy. So, speaking back on, my clinical days, everything in counseling, and this is obviously very different, everything in counseling was 100% confidential, except in cases of harm to self, harm to others, child abuse, or elder abuse. Everything else is confidential. So if someone says to you that they're going to hurt themselves or hurt other people, that is no longer a private conversation. That turns into, I must get this person connected to resources because it could literally change the course of their life. And so usually speaking, like let's say that you are, let's say you have an employee assistance program. The good news is that employee assistance programs, they're all trained licensed therapists. And if you were to call an employee assistance program and say, I have this person, they're not safe right now, they're in another city, I don't know what to do, they can alert emergency services where that person is located to go do a wellness check. I used to be an EAP counselor. I cannot tell you the number of times I've had to do that. And granted, just if someone shares that emergency situation, it doesn't mean you go call the EAP or emergency services without telling them. You have to say, you've told me that you're going to hurt yourself. I can't just let this information go unactioned. We have to do something about this. Please let me help you. Generally speaking, people who are in a self-harm mode will be receptive to that help. They want to feel like they don't have to do something that is very bad. And so generally speaking, you want to make sure, again, statement of intention, context. You've told me this. I'm worried about you. This is not something that should stay with the two of us. There are resources that can help us right now. Let me help you do that. So depending on the emergency protocols that are in your organization, and I highly encourage anybody watching this to be aware of the emergency mental health protocols in your company, because generally speaking, your health and safety professionals or your HR professionals will have a protocol, and they'll tell you who to call first, who to call second, and what that plan is. But please understand, in those moments of emergency where someone might be potentially harmful to themselves or others, that's no longer a private conversation. But you have to tell them, this is why it can't stay with us. This is what we're going to do. This is why we're going to do it. Let's do it together. And that is not supposed to stay with you because you're not a psychiatrist. You're not a therapist. You're not a doctor. You're not the best person to help them. So you have to connect them to the people who are.
Melissa, I want to ask you now about leadership and management. You've written a
Mhm.
lot about what managers should do to foster a safe working environment and promote positive, constructive discussions about mental health. But the fact is, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's true, a lot of people in management positions simply do not have the interpersonal skills or emotional
Yeah.
maturity to have these
Mhm.
kinds of conversations. So, what
Yeah.
does an employee do with a manager like that?
I like to refer to some of those managers as emotionally constipated, and they have trouble kind of like just getting the flow right. But the thing is that just because someone is a manager doesn't mean they should be, doesn't mean they know how to be a good manager. And again, you're both chronologically aged adults. There can be a lot of opportunities where you might need to manage up and you might need to explain to that person why this conversation is important, even beyond yourself. And so keep in mind, and I wrote a lot about this in the book, there are lots of reasons why managers don't talk about mental health at work or why they're not comfortable to talk about it. It could be their own discomfort with the topic. They could have their own stuff going on that they're worried will come out if they start talking about it with other people. It could be they shared about their mental health at a previous job and it went spectacularly wrong. It could be the family that raised them. It could be that they just don't care about the topic. It could be that they're towing the company line and no one else talks about it, and that's why they don't talk about it. You cannot assume the reason why they're not talking about it. You just can't. There's too many possibilities. So when it comes to starting that conversation and managing up, again, statement of intention, context, what's the why? Why are you bringing it to them? And you want to educate, not berate. I'm going to say that again. You want to educate, not berate. Because if you go to a manager saying, you're letting me down by not talking about this, you're letting the team down by not talking about this, it's probably not going to fly very well. So it's really about coming to them and saying, I don't want to assume the reason why we don't talk about this as a team, but it is really important because we all have our own stuff going on and it's good to be at least somewhat connected, to be reasonably supportive to each other. I would really like for us to talk about this. Can you please help me understand why we haven't yet? Lead with questions, seek to understand, because they might just say, I had no idea you guys wanted to talk about it, or I'm nervous to talk about it because I didn't want to cross a boundary with you. You got to realize that leaders are fallible humans just like you. So it's about seeking to understand the absence of those conversations and seeing if you can come to, a mutual understanding about them learning to value that more in their team. And some of it is really they don't know what they don't know. Or if they have their own personal obstacles to get over, that's a them problem. It's not a you problem. But sometimes you got to take off their blinders if they don't understand they need to do that themselves.
So there's an underlying theme through most of what you've talked about so far,
Hmm.
and that is trust. How
Yeah,
important is trust in the workplace? Trusting your boss, trusting your staff, trusting your colleagues.
it's the bedrock of everything. Without trust, I wish you guys the best of luck in having this conversation in the workplace. Because if we look, for example, at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, trust, especially in that social line, which is about 3 steps up, without trust, you cannot ascend to self-actualization, which is basically, feeling like you're aligned as a person, doing good work, things like that. If we look at Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team and what the functional behaviors look like, trust is the bedrock. If you don't feel trust or psychological safety with the other human beings around you, your survival mechanisms in your brain will go, warning, warning, do not proceed, danger imminent, shutdown imminent. Because without trust, your body is warning you, this is not safe. This is a threat in your environment that you should not engage with. When you don't feel trust with other people, that terrible feeling in the pit of your stomach, and when you feel just you're kind of going like this, even if not physically, that is your fight, flight, or freeze response in your brain going, saber-toothed tiger in the corner trying to make you its amuse-bouche. But it can't tell the difference between that threat and people who make you feel unsafe. Trust is at the base of it all. You have to build trust when it comes to these sorts of conversations, and don't give people a reason not to trust you.
Now, Melissa, you've made it very clear in the book that colleagues and managers are not expected to be therapists or to give advice. And this can be a real challenge for people like me who have a rescue personality and who want to solve every issue. What advice do you have for people like that?
I see you, I hear you, I feel you. And keep in mind, especially in my line of work and being a fixer, you have to be constantly aware of not switching on that characteristic, because believe it or not, when we constantly go into fixer mode, you're actually robbing people of opportunities to learn how to fix something themselves. And on top of that, people don't always need the fixing. Sometimes they just need to be heard. Sometimes they just need to be listened to. And one of the most powerful questions you can ask somebody, and we're not often asked this question in life because we're not taught to ask it, is, do you want help fixing this, or do you just want me to listen? How can I be most helpful? The average person is never asked that question. So you got to take off the cape, resist the urge to immediately jump in and fix, because not only is that not what the person might want in that moment, but it actually might be counterproductive to them learning how to help themselves. And so, being a fixer and being supportive is awesome, but it's not what people need all the time.
That's really great advice. Now, you may not want to hear this, Melissa, but I think it needs to be said.
Tell me.
There are some people out there who use mental health issues, or maybe even fabricate them, as an excuse to explain why they're not getting their work done.
Yep.
How is a manager to know when an employee is being sincere about a genuine problem?
So not only do I not like hearing that, because I know it's true, I've witnessed it. I wrote about it in the book, because it's not a popular thing to say, but someone has to say it because it's true. I have lost count of the number of managers I've met or people that I've met who witnessed people who were crying wolf and saying that mental health was the reason that they dropped the ball on a project. And not only was it not true, but then that invalidates the stories of others where it is true. So then if you're influencing those opinions and making managers think that when someone says they're having a mental health problem at work, that it's total BS, you are screwing all the people after you who do need that accommodation and do have a real story. That's not okay. Not okay at all. If people are using, mental health as a reason that they are, struggling, or they don't want to take accountability or responsibility for screwing something up at work, that is you being very not emotionally intelligent and absolving yourself of personal responsibility and using the narrative of a movement that took thousands and thousands and thousands of people to make progress on, and just slapping them all in the face. That's what that is. Or let's say, for example, this is even more unpopular to say, that if someone does have a mental health condition of some kind and they totally screwed up a project and it had nothing to do with your emotional health issues, but you used it as a crutch, and the first time that you told a manager about it, do you really think that's going to help with the validity of your story? You cannot use that as a reason that something went wrong if it's not the truth, because that is not doing a favor for yourself or anyone else. And so the trouble is that as a manager, when you encounter those behaviors, you don't know which type of story you're dealing with. And you can't come out of the gate saying, I think you're lying. You can't do that. It's about monitoring and asking the right questions. And I know that is not a concrete answer, but it's literally the truth, because it's so many shades of gray and completely situationally dependent and individually dependent. So it's really about seeing when the disclosures happen. Why is the disclosure happening? Timing can be very interesting when it comes up to those sorts of shares. And if someone is just saying, oh, I didn't do this because this happened, and you respond in a very empathetic way, go, oh, how can I support you? Do you want to talk? And they go, oh, no, I'm good. Granted, you don't know why they might respond like that, but it's by asking the right questions and looking at the situation to see what sort of story you might be dealing with. And then if it ends up being a crying wolf story, that is very difficult to deal with, because you want to be able to share your experience of what that person said and how it's impacting the situation. But it's also a very precarious line to walk, because you can't say, I knew you were not, telling the truth, and, I don't trust you anymore. It becomes a very complex situation if you can tell that someone was using that story in a way to hide poor performance. That is a very tough situation to be in. And as I am not legally trained like you, Harvey, I can't comment on the legal implications and the precarious nature of that. But it's very much knowing how to have that conversation and trying to get the truth to come to the surface so you can have a mutual agreement on how to go forward. Because if someone, effectively, if you catch them in the lie, if you turn that into a punitive situation or immediately sending to HR situation, that's a great way for things to be set on fire. So it's about trying to find a way of, let's say the person used it as an excuse because they were terrified to tell you that they didn't know how to do the project or they didn't know how to do the right thing. It could be a case of finding shared understanding that honesty should be prioritized going forward. You don't want them to feel like they're getting, punished by teacher. You're two adults. You want to try and come to an understanding of why you're not going to do that again and how you value honesty going forward. And if it goes beyond that, where that person is a bit unwilling to admit the mistake or admit the white lie and all that sort of stuff, then it becomes a case of potentially escalating to the right people in your organization, and at least initially doing so anonymously, saying, I had a situation with a team member. This is what's happening. I don't know what to do. What do you advise? And then by doing that anonymously, you can try and see how you can manage the situation. But then again, if it becomes untenable, because Harvey, we can admit, not everybody has best intentions in mind. We can be honest that those people do exist. So if it comes to the case, as a manager, you've done everything you can, and someone is unwilling to do the right thing or meet you where you are, and you try to deal with it anonymously and do all these other sorts of things, then it becomes an escalation issue, and trying to find out what the protocols are within your organization, any sort of legal implications. And I unfortunately can't comment on that, not as a trained attorney, but there are lots of things you can do ahead of that to understand why they did it. Are they willing to not do it again? And what the right thing to do looks like going forward, because you don't want to greet that sort of behavior with an immediate negative reinforcement, because the odds of that person changing their behavior would diminish rapidly.
Yeah, very true. Your book has an entire chapter dealing with the mental health implications of COVID, such as chronic stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, hypochondria. What are you seeing in the workplaces you've dealt with?
Oh gosh, it's all of that and more. So I have never witnessed hypochondriasis, which is a fancy word for health anxiety, on a global scale. It's unbelievable. We forget the common cold exists and the common flu exists. The minute we don't feel well, this is the end of me. I've caught the virus, who knows what's going to happen. And reentry anxiety, which psychologists came up with in the beginning of the pandemic, that a lot of people are still terrified to be around each other, absolutely terrified, because they're worried about getting sick. And they're afraid to be around other people because they carry the illness. And so it's unbelievable, because in the before time versus now, how people feel, what okay looks like, what safe looks like, what happy looks like, It's all changed. How we experience those emotions versus now is forever changed. And every person is different in some way since the pandemic started. And even though this data is, over a year old now, the CDC reported in the United States that between June 2020 and June 2021, the rates of clinical anxiety and depression diagnoses in the US quadrupled. That's a lot. And we're also seeing, for example, the Gallup Global Emotions Report from 2021. Gallup's been around for a really long time. And they did a survey in 2020 that showed 2020 was literally the most stressful and unhappy year in their entire history of measuring data. There's not even a word for that. And so not only do we have this pandemic happening, but make no mistake, there is a mental illness epidemic. It's already here. The supply cannot meet the demand. And the ripple effects of this, not only of us as adults, but the younger generations who are experiencing this too, it's going to be a tsunami. And I hate to say that, but it's the truth. And that's why this conversation, we cannot exist in the world of work without talking about mental health any longer. That is willful negligence at this point. And just because people aren't talking about it doesn't mean they're not feeling that struggle.
Now, you talked about reentry anxiety, which, if I understand correctly, it's the fear of socializing again.
Yes, for the fear of catching the virus. Yes, I still see people, and granted, everybody has different safety protocols, and you have to stick to what makes you feel safe. There are people that still now, they go out in public with gloves on, a mask, a face shield, and that's what makes them feel safe. There are people who will be forever impacted by this because it just traumatized them too much. There are lots of people who are, because the return to work plans have been delayed for lots of companies, and there's some folks that they don't want to go back to the office. They want to keep working from home because it either works well for them or they're just too afraid to be around other people. So every business is going through this struggle right now where they're trying to get some people, back into the office, but the workforce is terrified. This is a slow burn to work these things out because we found incredible ways to work remotely and accomplish amazing things in the past couple of years. And so for some of the organizations who want to get back, into a common space, not all of their workforce is willing to do that. Then what do you do? This is very much a gray area because it's still being worked out. Even though it's 2 years, we're very early days in all of this, even though people don't want to admit it.
Well, has anything good come from COVID in terms of mental health?
Most definitely. It put the conversation front and center on the world of work table, and it's never going away. The thing is that it was always an important conversation, but when the pandemic happened and a threat was literally circulating the globe, which made most people have an existential crisis of self, people finally realized we have to talk about this. We can't not talk about this. And when our lives were simplified by staying home, by not going out and socializing as much, it really made us take a hard, long look at what are my values? What do I think is important? Why do I have these certain people in my life? Am I happy with my job? What do I want to change? Because it could all end tomorrow. And so people really have gotten that time to slow down and kind of have a personal come to Jesus conversation in terms of what they don't like and what is within their control to change. There's lots of people who have had a reshuffling of relationships because in this pandemic, it has become highly politicized. People have really taken a good hard look at their relationships, saying which of these relationships fuel me and which of them don't make me feel good. So there has been a deepening of connections and relationships, and especially with working from home, you have literally been getting a chance to peer into people's lives and discover things about each other that you just wouldn't have known before. And so while this is not toxic positivity, it's also okay to realize the flecks of good that have come out of this, because guys, if we're not making any sort of learnings from all of this, what are we doing?
Yeah. One of the most compelling chapters in your book deals with the mental health impact of racism and inequality in America. You wrote that racial minorities need to feel emotionally supported at work because being discriminated against does impact mental health. What's the most important thing employers can do to show empathy and support to racial minorities at work?
That is such an important question. And as I wrote in the book, I cannot imagine the pain of seeing, particularly what the Black community has been through in recent years, and feeling like you have to put on a verbal mask and you can't talk about it at work because of the discomfort of others. I cannot imagine that pain. And the thing is that some employers, they seem to vacillate between doing nothing because they don't want to touch that, which is so incredibly wrong, and going to folks in the Black community in their organizations saying, oh, will you be the poster child for our DEI initiative? Also equally inappropriate and not okay. The best thing to do is to authentically create space. Each person is having their own experience or their own trauma of what they're seeing their community go through. This doesn't mean putting them up as a poster child, which is completely inauthentic, or avoiding the conversation altogether. It's about creating space to acknowledge what is objectively happening and letting people know you have the option without the obligation to talk about this with your work community if you so choose. We want to be allies. We want to be here to support you. We want you to maybe, if you feel comfortable, to teach us some of the things that maybe we don't know so we can be better allies. You want to avoid those extremes. It's just about creating space. And most importantly, asking, what does good help look like? If you don't know, you can ask what that good help looks like, because making assumptions of what it does look like is a great recipe for a misunderstanding. Create space, option without obligation to share, and ask how you can authentically help to support that person and the community beyond what you think might help, because what we think might help is often not what is helpful.
Well, Melissa, I so appreciate reading your book and having this opportunity to delve into some of the issues you've spent your career working on to make the working world a more empathetic and compassionate place. Thank you so much for writing this book and for coming on our show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it is honestly my pleasure. And I'm so deeply appreciative that you're passionate about this topic. And it takes a chorus of voices to make change. And I'm trying to put my dent in the universe. And I want this message to go to as many human beings as possible across the planet, because things have to change.
Well, thank you for doing that. I hope that all of our viewers will read this book and get their colleagues, managers, supervisors, families to read this book. It really is probably the most important book I have read in a really long time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Harvey. That means the world to me. And that's really the goal, to anybody who's watching or listening to this, is I want to get the education in as many hands as possible, because it's all about the ripple effect. What each person does, and when they do it well, can inspire others to do the same thing. And if your organization doesn't know how to start this conversation, they're not sure what to do, they might be afraid, please reach out to me. I would love to help your company to open up this conversation in a constructive and realistic way. That's the goal. Feel free to connect with me, LinkedIn, Instagram, my website, melissadoman.com, and we'll see what we can get done for you guys.
Thanks, Melissa. Our guest has been organizational psychologist and author Melissa Doman, author of Yes, You Can Talk About Mental Health at Work. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.